Good afternoon, and welcome to Groceryshop. I am Ken Cassar, VP of Research with Groceryshop. We will have some live polling, so I'd encourage everybody to pay attention to the notes on the screen in front of you, so that you can figure out how to work the live polling. With that said, we will dive into the presentation. Okay, so the panel that we just had some, I think, interesting insights on improving wholesale and kind of the wholesale model, collaboration between retailers and brands. Now we're going to kind of pivot to a disruption of the wholesale model that we have seen with digitally native brands, with a specific focus on marketing, the marketing that has worked for digitally native brands. But before I go any farther, the one thing I do want to make sure that we're aligned on is what we mean when we say digitally native brands, because there are a lot of terms out there that are sort of similar to and adjacent. Digitally native vertical brands, direct to consumer. When we talk about a digitally native brand, we mean it's a brand that started online, selling directly to consumers. They may now have wholesale relationships, but if they started selling online direct, they hit our definition. They make their own products. They may well outsource the manufacturing, but they're specifically defining the components of those products. And today we're going to focus largely on CPG brands. Specifically, as we were doing our research, we really kind of honed in on this group of 50 or so digitally native brands that came up pretty prominently in our research. So when you see some of the data that we'll present, kind of center yourself on this group of brands. As far as the agenda goes, we'll start off by looking at kind of the underlying enablers of digitally native brands and why they've been able to pop on the scene. Then we'll dive into their marketing tactics. Then we'll look at what's next for digitally native brands. And then we'll look at how traditional CPG brands are responding to that. I do want to thank a group of 6 people, sort of a virtual panel of experts that we had spoken with as we were creating this research, and you will hear insightful comments from each of these folks throughout. The thing that became, and before we kind of get into the marketing, the thing that became abundantly clear to us from the interviews that we had done is that there is an engine that sort of drives the success of the digitally native brands that we looked at that are successful, and specifically those are nimble teams that are unsiloed, they're small. Yes, their marketing is iterative, it's experimental, their products are on key for their particular customers, but there's sort of a business jujitsu that these companies were all able to pull off that allowed them to sort of use their smallness to their advantage. And the reason that these companies were able to be small but effective is because we've seen the emergence of sort of a retail tech stack over the past 5 to 8 years that is dramatically cheaper, faster, and better than what existed before it. Over the past 5 years, we saw the maturation of tools. Shopify and AWS are good examples of that allowed a small brand to be able to quickly build a world-class website and to host it. We saw third-party logistics companies plug much more easily into a small website, and we're actually seeing an acceleration of that. And we've seen an escalation and improvement in the marketing tools that brands are able to use that allow small brands to operate sort of at a world-class level. We do believe that the maturation of this tool set, this retail tech stack, and the rise of digitally native brands that coincided with each other, we don't actually believe that it is a pure coincidence. We think that there is a sort of a causal relationship there. And And the last part, when we talk about this responsive model that we want to talk about, sort of the oil that lubricates this machine is the data that spins out of DTC businesses. Every business generates data. Every business generates a lot of data, but with direct-to-consumer based brands, the information that they collect at an individual level is really pretty powerful. So for every customer, for every prospect, they know what those folks have bought. They know that they visited the website, what they've looked at, what they have purchased, what they haven't. They know what they've returned. They see the full path to purchase. Proceeding to the purchase itself, and they also see the marketing messages and the marketing promotions that they responded to, and so we'll put a little bit of color around that. So Andrew Thomas is the first of the panelists that we'll talk to today. Is the VP of Brand Marketing at Soylent and an alum of a large CPG brand. And he had talked about the fact that in the earliest days they were able to work with small teams, very, very well coordinated and integrated. And he commented on how different that was at sort of an old school traditional CPG. And he talked about the fact that this was the case within the marketing function. So the social person was not operating in a silo, unaware of what the search team or search person was working on. But he also talked about how that extended beyond beyond departments as well, and how because they were small, they were able to work so effectively with each other. Heidi DeRosen is Chief Marketing Officer of Madison Reed, also an alum of another big CPG brand with some interesting perspective. And she talks about the velocity of decision-making that a direct-to-consumer business model provides for. We get robust consumer feedback at warp speed. The example that Heidi cites is a shelf reset. So a shelf reset in a traditional wholesale environment requires that you have retailer buy-in. Then we have to take the time to set it up. We have to wait for it to be set up, and then we're stuck with it for a while. And she contrasts this with the digital shelf, where there's not a need for buy-in from the retailer, and it's easy to iterate in order to find kind of what works particularly well. Jordana Keir is a co-founder and co-CEO of Lola, and she talks about the virtues of the direct engagement that they have with consumers, and she believes that it's their ability to talk to and listen to consumers that allowed them to realize, kind of have the epiphany that they could elevate how they thought about their brand and the role that they played for their consumer. They started off thinking of themselves as a feminine care company. They expanded to looking at themselves as much more broadly supporting women's health from a woman's first period all the way through menopause. One of the things that, when we think about digitally native brands that often comes up is the idea of millennials. And when we were interviewing Pat Robinson, he's the managing director at Circle Up, which is a venture capital company that supports smaller CPG brands. We asked Pat why millennials are so engaged with digitally native brands. What is it about millennials? And he had said, well, the thing is that digitally native brands are started by millennials, and they're fixing the problems that they've experienced. And we kind of scratched our heads a little bit on that one and say, is that really true? And so I will put up our first polling question. So grab your phone so that you can vote. So millennials make up 23% of the U.S. population. And so the question is, what percent of founders of digitally native brands do you believe are millennials? And we have options ranging from 10% up to 100%. And if we could see the polling results. That we don't see the polling. I can see the polling results, and you can too. So the most common response is D, which is now at 56%, and you are indeed right. When we looked at our data. we found that of the founding team, so of the 102 people that were among the founding members of digitally native brands, the 50 that we had looked at, 69% were under the age of 35 when they started these companies. And what's interesting is how that contrasts with what we see from the Fortune 500, where the average age of a Fortune 500 CEO when they start is 50 years old. I think what's even more striking, though, is what this looks like when we look at it from a gender perspective. 36% of the founders of digitally native brands in the CPG space were female at the inception, and that compares with 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs that are women. The age difference, I think, when we look at Fortune 500 companies, it makes some sense. You might need more experienced people to run more complex organizations. The gender difference, though, we think is a pretty clear disadvantage for larger companies, especially those that aspire to sell products to women. This is an issue that is probably fixable for big brands, but we do believe that it's the second big structural advantage that digitally native brands have over their traditional competitors. The first being that responsive model that we had talked about. Now we'll dive into the marketing tactics that have been successfully employed by digitally native brands. We're going to start off by looking at the marketing messaging tactics that they have used. We'll sort of illustrate and quantify, and then we'll look at the media tactics that they have used. The founders of Keeps were alarmed when they woke up one day and found that their hairlines were receding. The founders of Harry's were frustrated when they had to find someone with a key that would unlock the cabinet selling razors that they believed were overpriced. The thing that we see very, very commonly amongst digitally native brands is that they express their brands as stories anchored in the pain points of the founders. In fact, 80% of the digitally native brands that we looked at sort of use this tactic as they kind of define their brands to consumers. Many digitally native brands talk about the value that they provide where the consumer doesn't have to make trade-offs. In some cases, they talk about the removal of the middleman. We have Quip talking about that explicitly, ColourPop as well. Many talk about a transparency of ingredients. Interestingly, transparency of ingredients is something that we've heard today from a lot of larger brands as well as becoming an increasingly high priority. Ritual, for example, takes it to the level where Ritual is a vitamin company. They will show us where the particular minerals are mined that they make their products with. Madison Reed sort of takes that to marketing. And they don't do any retouching or photoshopping of their models. By the way, on the transparency of ingredient side, 92% of the digitally native CPG brands that we looked at talked about transparency of ingredients. This idea of transparency in some cases extends into pricing. We've seen a number of brands do this. Everlane, sort of a not CPG player, but it's certainly a digitally native brand in the apparel space. For this particular modern loafer, for example, breaks down our costs in a very, very explicit manner. And they take what a lot of brands might see as a little bit of a risk by telling us that this loafer that we're paying $168 for actually costs them $58. Of course, they're banking on the fact that we probably are going to be happy that at least we're not paying $270 for it. So again, but part of that broader sort of move toward transparency. Social purpose is something that we have heard a lot from big brands today, and that we see as kind of just an innate core element of digitally native brands. Thinx talks about period poverty. Other brands talk about that as well. Bevel started with the idea that personal care products were not designed for people with sort of the skin and hair attributes of people that aren't white. Beauty Counter talks about safer products. They marched their 30,000 consultants into Washington, D.C. To demand that there's more more regulation around safer products. They put a payphone in their New York store with the telephone numbers of your representatives, so you can call your rep and campaign for better products. 86% of the digitally native brands that we looked at had employed sort of a social purpose message. Environmental responsibility, sort of adjacent to the social issues, are very, very common. Teodora is a Brazilian beauty products brand that is talking about conservation. Probably an important message from a Brazilian brand. Ritual, Nature Box, and many others talk more broadly about sustainability. 64% of the digitally native brands that we had looked at are employing some sort of messaging around environmental responsibility. The other thing about digitally native brands is that they're much more likely to employ to use messaging that a traditional brand might shy away from. Dollar Shave Club doesn't shy away from profanity. Soylent embraces genetically modified organisms. Billy, a women's razor brand, encourages women to not shave their bodies if they don't want to. If they do, Billy might be the razor for them. And what's interesting is that for these brands, the idea of authentic, on-target messaging is pretty critical to their brand, to who they are. If they were to back off and start to become kind of generic in their messaging, they start to lose a key part of what defines their relationships with customers. And so when we quantify all of that, and this is definitely one of those slides you want to take the picture of. When we quantify all of that, we see that there are actually 4 of those messaging tactics that are used by more than 60% of digitally native brands, and so it's not surprising. I think that we would see some repetition and some common themes, but there is also a little bit of a risk of homogeneity, that the consumers might start to perceive what these folks are doing as a bit formulaic, and it does create a risk of rip-offability, whether it's traditional brands sort of adopting those techniques, whether it's other digitally native brands adopting those techniques, or whether it's retailers adopting these techniques. This is a Target private label brand. This is a Walmart private label brand, and interestingly, just a couple of days ago, Mark Lorey had said that Walmart is making a significant shift in strategy from big acquisitions of existing brands to starting their own brands online and then moving them into brick and mortar stores. Clearly, they're adopting some of the things that worked well for Cassar and folks like that, and they're bringing it into their stores. So this risk of homogeneity, I think, is a pretty significant one that is going to work to the advantage of retailers if we don't start to see a little more diversification in messaging. And I want to digress a little bit here. So millennials account for 22% of U.S. GDP, 23% of U.S. population, but they account for 45% of sales of digitally native brands. This is data from Rakuten. And so we would sort of expect to see an over-index, but we're also seeing that there's a lot of spillover outside of millennials. So the majority of sales for digitally native brands are actually going to non-millennials. And so I think it's an indication that these messages are more universal than to just millennials. But I think it also points to the fact that there are probably a lot of other opportunities out there for digitally native brands that are a little bit less honed in on millennials. We've seen a little bit of that, but I think that there's probably a lot of opportunity. Now let's move into media tactics. What media have these folks used, and how have they used it in order to become successful? This is data from Toluna, which I think quantifies what most of us would expect. So they looked at how consumers of DTC brands, and not digitally native, but I think pretty close, for their first purchase of a digitally native brand, where did they first hear about that brand? 60% of the time it was from either search or social. And again, I don't think that this is a big surprise. When we talked to Brian Fesson, who's the head of marketing at Mack Weldon, He talks about how in the earliest days when they were building the brand, how he was logging into Facebook and Google every 15 minutes. And the thing that really struck him was the speed of feedback, the feedback loops that they were able to enjoy because of these marketing tactics that they were using. And this really does underscore the virtues of the direct business model and the data that you can collect from consumers at the individual level when it plugs into that healthy, responsive model that we had talked about before. I think in order to understand how advertising is changing, not just for digitally native brands, but I think for all brands, it's useful to look at where advertising has come from. So TV was critical to the development of the great brands of the post-war era that still dominate our grocery shelves. So TV delivered mass audiences, and big CPG brands built mass products for those mass audiences. For those in the audience that are Mad Men fans, this is, of course, Harry Crane, who was an innovator in 1960s era Mad Men, understanding the power of television before other folks understood the power of television. He was a geek when it wasn't cool, but he became a hero at Sterling Cooper, which, of course, was the ad agency. I assume everybody watches Mad Men? So these references are not okay, because he understood how important TV was. Emily Weiss of Glossier and those like her are really kind of the modern manifestations, I think, of Harry Crane. They uniquely understood the capabilities of this channel. Back to Brian from Mack Weldon. He had talked about the rise of lookalike models about 5 or so, maybe 7 years ago, and how they had started with audiences that they used traditional tactics to build. And then they plugged those into lookalike models, and they largely took targeting out of the equation. And so, he tells a story that really sort of illustrates that leap of faith. For those not familiar, Mack Weldon makes well-made, fairly expensive men's basics, underpants, t-shirts, jeans, and things like that. 85% of Mack Weldon sales, probably not surprisingly, are to men. During holiday 2018, though, Facebook's targeting algorithms started delivering women. At one point in time, they found that 70% of their sales were coming from women. There was a flip in consumer behavior, obviously, as we were getting close to the holiday and wives were looking to replace their husbands' tattered underpants. That became evident because Mack Weldon was willing to embrace this. They were willing to take a leap of faith with this emerging technique. Brian, by the way, is of the belief that it's not a coincidence that digitally native brands rose in prominence at the same time that we started to see the rise of lookalike modeling. So now we're going to change gears a little bit and look at what's next for digitally native brands. Before we do so, though, let's do another poll question. If you're a CPG brand, a digitally native CPG brand, would you, as you're looking to sort of hit that next level of growth, open lots and lots of stores? Would you establish wholesale relationships with retailers? Would you maintain a core as a digital-only retailer? And I'll give you the cop-out, all of the above answer. So everybody sort of vote, and let's see what you have to say about that. And interestingly, the 55% at last count are suggesting maintaining a core as a digital first retailer. I was expecting that everybody would take the cop-out answer, but maybe since I identified it as a cop-out answer, that sort of discouraged things. So on that note, we are absolutely seeing digitally native brands moving into traditional media. So we have Thinx and many other digitally native brands advertising in New York City subways, and we're also seeing them invest in outdoor and other traditional media. And on the TV side, we are seeing more and more advertising by digitally native brands. This is data from iSpot TV, where they took our list of 50 digitally native brands and identified that in the most recent 12 months, this should be labeled in the slide, in the most recent 12 months ending in August 2019, 20 of the 50 digitally native brands had done some form of television advertising, up from 15 the year before. The total level of spend actually dropped a little bit. Actually entirely attributable to Blue Apron scaling back their advertising. So we are seeing some of that, but we're not seeing as much as I might have guessed we would have seen a couple of years ago. Some digitally native brands on the CPG side are in the early stages of opening stores. Glossier now has 3 stores. Winky Lux has 3 stores. These 2 stores are really, really compelling showcases for their product. Imagine an Apple store for beauty, but then imagine that with irresistible Instagram settings for the folks that are into that sort of thing. But when we quantify it, it was interesting to me that the vast majority, 82% of CPG digitally native brands have not opened any stores. And amongst those that have, in most cases, is just 1 or 2 stores. We didn't find a single example of a CPG digitally native brand that had said that they plan to open hundreds of stores and really kind of pursue the model, where we are starting to hear a little bit of that from folks in the apparel digitally native brand space. The most important evolution, we believe, for digitally native brands is into wholesale. The Harry's Target relationship, we think, was the first big one that we heard about, and we have seen more and more of that over the course of time. Harry's is a bit opaque about how big a deal wholesale is for their overall business. I did look everywhere to try to see if I could pin a number on that. And amongst digitally native CPG brands, now 50% have migrated from pure direct-to-consumer to hybrid direct-to-consumer wholesale businesses. Where are they putting their bets when they're striking these partnerships? 12% are striking relationships with retailers that are online native retailers. Most, though, are striking deals with native brick and mortar retailers, whether they're striking deals with just those folks or both native brick and mortar retailers as well as native online retailers. So it does seem that digitally native brands are as bought into the virtues of stores as I think most of us are. And back to Pat Robinson from Circle Up, he had talked about sort of, kind of 2 models of thinking about customer centricity. He had noted that digitally native brands, when they talk about customer centricity, it really kind of comes back to the fact that they can both communicate with and share and hear from their customers. He looks at wholesale brands, though, and said, well, they're equally customer centric. They just define it a little bit differently. For them, they're defining customer centricity by being where the consumer is. And this is an evolution from redefining customer centricity that a lot of digitally native brands are going through. And so now let's change gears and talk about traditional brands and what they're doing and how they're doing it. Lauren Jupiter, formerly an investment banker working for big CPG brands, has come over to the venture capital side, working in support of smaller CPG brands with Excel Foods. And she talks about the risk-reward equation and how at big brands it's kind of whacked. How the consequences of losing a few $1 million are worse than the consequences or the rewards of making a few extra $100 million or a few extra $1 million. And this is kind of an endemic problem that I think big brands, big CPG brands, are trying to figure out how to deal with. And I would say it's not obvious to me exactly how they're going to work through that. But big CPG brands understand the trends that we're seeing, and they're addressing it. Every large CPG holding company has an incubator, an internal venture capital wing, or both. They're making acquisitions of digitally native brands, large acquisitions, small acquisitions, and they're reorganizing. Chobani recently announced that they're reorganizing in order to become more nimble, more team-centric. Campbell's, my friend Craig Slavchev from Campbell's, who was in the Wall Street Journal recently, talking about how they're adopting software industry technologies and techniques in order to become a lot quicker with their product development. Procter & Gamble. This is a quote from David Taylor of Procter & Gamble talking about the fact that they have a first-party database of 1 billion people, and talking about moving from generic demographic targets like women 18 to 49 into much, much more granular, actionable targets like first-time moms and first-time washing machine owners. It really struck me when I saw this quote that this is the CEO of Procter & Gamble, the company that all but invented the GRP, talking about a very, very different way of thinking about marketing. Traditional CPG brands have shifted dollars out of television into digital. Within digital, they have been as heavily focused on social as other brands. And as a result of it, we see companies like Maybelline actually has more Instagram followers than either Glossier or ColourPop. Both Maybelline and Revlon have more Facebook followers than Glossier and ColourPop combined. So this is interesting to me, and so what we're seeing is sort of TV dollars going into social, but we're also seeing social coming into TV as well. And let's watch this video together.
Sun care is self-care. I used to not love wearing an SPF just because I felt like it was so oily and greasy and that it was gonna clog my pores. But what I love about Olay Regenerist Whip with SPF 25 is that it's lightweight, it's barely there. And then I can put makeup on over it if I want, or if I'm not working, just roll. It's perfect for me. I'm Busy Phillips and I'm fearless to face anything.
All right, so clearly Olay is employing some of the tactics that social kind of invented. We have a selfie style video. We have a very authentic look. We can see Busy's moles. She's speaking in a familiar language, in a familiar tone, but they've moved it into their wheelhouse. It's of high production quality, and most importantly, it's on TV. So they're taking these earned media tactics and they're putting it in a paid media environment. And depending upon how you look at it, you could kind of see this as an elevation of the form from a junior varsity little league form of marketing to the pinnacle of professional sports, in my opinion. So you could look at it as a significant elevation of the form, but you could also take a negative view. It's just a corporate misunderstanding of something beautiful and authentic. I will admit that it's easy to be cynical here, but the Busy Phillips video on YouTube has 26,000 views. iSpot TV tells us that that advertisement has garnered 1.8 billion impressions. And so 26,000 versus 1.8 billion. So you can argue with the fact that they figured out how to get it in front of a lot of people, which is interesting. Nike. Nike represents brands generally that are getting more comfortable with the idea of courting risky topics. It's something that Procter & Gamble had spoken about today. She was saying that they feel like it's their customers expect them to talk about important issues. Nike's decision to double down on Colin Kaepernick after he first took a knee in August 2016 was certainly a move that many people believed was risky. But when we fast forward, the results seem to be pretty positive. The people that Nike really wants to connect with seem to have doubled down and embraced the brand. And if you believe in the value of the stock price as a barometer of a company, Nike stock price since the day Colin Kaepernick took a knee for the first time is up 59% compared to the S&P 500 up 38%. So it seems to have worked well for Nike anyway. And kind of moving to wrap up, it's apparent to us that increasingly the best brands are coming to realize that a bigger risk to their brand equity isn't a spokesperson saying something unfortunate or getting arrested. It's the slow, gradual degradation of personal relevancy. We believe that we're at the beginning stages of moving from a world where we have a few big brands and where other represents a relatively small piece of the pie, to a world where we have many smaller brands and where other is going to represent a much larger piece of the pie. Fun fact for you all, in 1929, there were 3 flavors of ice cream. With improvements in manufacturing technology and distribution technology, over the next 90 years, we saw a huge explosion in new flavors of ice cream, which led to a dilution of the core 3 flavors over the next 90 years. Similarly, we believe that not because of manufacturing changes, but because of changes in marketing and the tool set available to new retailers, we're going to see the same thing happening with brands. Good news, from my perspective, as much as I enjoy the classic Neapolitan flavors, I much prefer Reese's Peanut Butter Cup flavor ice cream. And then finally, just a few closing thoughts. I just want to remind everybody, as you look at what digital native brands are doing, there is a risk of homogeneity that you want to be careful of. We're in the midst of this redefinition of customer centricity that we think is interesting and important. Wholesale, we think, for especially CPG digitally native brands is a really, really important thing that is beginning to happen. But we do believe that it's critical for digitally native brands to maintain their direct roots, their direct connections with the customer, even when wholesale overwhelms direct sales. Big CPG companies need to be nimbler, but at the end of the day, we can all look forward to more brands and presumably us as happier consumers. So that's it. I'm afraid we don't have time for questions, or do we? We do have time for questions. So we have a couple of mics, and so if anyone has a specific question, I'm happy to answer it. There's one here.
Can you talk? Thanks. That was very insightful. Thank you. Can you talk about the role of the spokesperson and how you said that is actually not the primary risk, as you said right at the end? And then is it the CEO that typically is the spokesperson? Is that the least risk thing to do, or hire spokespeople to create that customer connectivity?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different models. I think there are a lot of different models that can work. But the CEO as most prominent spokesperson is something that we've seen certainly from digitally native brands. But they also heavily use influencers, and so people that we would have called spokespeople in different environments. I think the key point on that though is whereas in the past your nightmare scenario might have been that your key spokespeople show up on TMZ making poor choices. Now that's not the biggest risk in the world. Like, you can actually live with that. You can manage it if it's helping you. If that relationship is kind of helping you remain targeted with those that are kind of your key buyers. Another question up front. Wait for the mic.
Thanks. Great presentation. One question I had when you highlighted the retail penetration of like Glossier, for example, opening their own specific owned and operated stores. Did you dig into any data at all about the current scale from these new types of department stores for DTC brands like Neighborhood Goods or Showfields, for example, and if they're gaining any market share?
We weren't able to collect that data, but yeah, I mean, definitely a lot of different formats, a lot of experimentation in order to allow people to touch and feel and try those products. But still, we believe that the big mover of the needle for these guys is going to be those wholesale relationships. Another?
So outside of the meal kit companies, you didn't really touch on too many food-specific digital-centric brands. Do you have some that you think are doing well, or is there a reason why we don't see more of those?
If you had asked that question 2 years ago, we all would have looked at the meal kit companies as really having figured that out. Yeah, the trick with food is that we need it to be fresh, and the costs associated with that have proven to be expensive. We did have some brands in the mix, but you're right, we were definitely much more heavily skewed toward beauty, where we've seen these companies do well. I think the food sector is a little bit less amenable than a lot of other sectors toward this, and it's interesting seeing the trajectory that the meal kit companies have taken as they've all experimented with different forms of wholesale, and it's kind of fascinating to see how that plays out. Okay, it looks like we're out of time. One last fun data point. We did do some research looking at CB Insights data to look at funding of digitally native brands, venture capital funding. And an interesting thing, we saw a peak not this past 12 months, but the year before that. Investment by venture capital in digitally native brands is about half this past 12 months of the prior. So venture capitalists seem to be a little bit less hyper-focused on the sector, but we do believe that the threat to traditional brands remains because of that tech stack. Because it's so much easier to start a brand right now, it's really not about venture capitalists sort of creating this environment. It really is about that tech stack doing so. So that is it. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll look forward to seeing you all around.